but there's a very useful thing that was just been shown. Okay? It's not a matter of, oh, nobody got any signatures. The difference between what we deployed ostensibly to do and what happened. Why was it? Why was that difference? Well, we're going to start with something here, and this will be up on our website. Over the last 2 hours, or sometime in the last 2 hours, I received a call which came from Jerry Rose, who'd spoken to Lyndon LaRouche and who had described to Lyndon LaRouche what the presentation was going to be that I was going to give for this meeting. He said, that's wrong. He said, you must start with Kepler. If you don't start with Kepler, if you don't start with physical science, you are wasting everyone's time. Why did he say this? Why did he say this? Now, this is very important because one has to understand what the Manhattan Project actually is. This has been used as a term and it's been described in various ways by various people. Since I happen to be in the center of this, and I'm the person that designed the presentation, and that's the presentation that Lyndon LaRouche said would be wrong, then I feel highly qualified to speak to exactly this issue of what the Manhattan Project is. The situation now, worldwide, is that right now, mankind will be plunged into a thermonuclear war unless a group of people decide that they are capable of actually acting on behalf of humanity as opposed to bestiality. If that does not happen, no matter what good intentions anybody expresses, no matter what it is people think they are doing, despite that, we will be destroyed. Why? Because the civilization will have proven that it is morally unfit to survive. How will it do that? It will do that because under the guise of actually addressing the problem, people will actually go along with the problem. But they would just have good words, pretty words, or ugly words, which basically accompany their way to the grave. Even as they convince themselves, they delude themselves they're doing the right thing. Now, this is a very important point because Lynn has consistently insisted on this idea of this scientist, Johannes Kepler, and his work as being essential for everyone to understand and everyone to start from the standpoint of his work. This is crucial because one of the elements of the Manhattan Project, just let's say directly, is see, Lynn is not a Confederate. He does not believe in confederacies. He doesn't believe in confederacies of dunces. He doesn't believe really of confederacies of ostensibly smart people who think they are doing something they're not doing. You know, people are very willing to criticize the United States Congress for what it doesn't do. But if you were talking to the people in the Congress, and you talk to them often, of course, one by one, often they can give you very intelligent reasons why they're really doing something important. And actually, the things they say are sometimes important. But the truth is, civilization will be doomed by their interpretation of what they think is important. Whatever they think they are doing. How does one remove oneself from that situation? That's the first thing. Well, so what we're going to do is I'm going to refer to something here because Lynn is very critical about what he calls people being practical. People try to find the thing that will practically work. They're willing to talk about something else that they understand to be true, but they are not willing to do what's needed to be done to get that new objective, in this case, the Eurasian Land Bridge and the New Silk Road and the World Land Bridge, the evolved concept that Lynn put forward. How would that actually be accomplished? So what I'm going to do is to refer here to, since the conference we've been doing, they've all been Schiller Institute conferences, it's a good idea to refer to Friedrich Schiller here and his essay on universal history. Why universal history? Well, because when we intervene in New York on behalf of Greece, we're intervening on behalf of universal history. When we intervene with respect to the idea of creating a new economic and credit system, we're intervening from the standpoint of universal history. When we speak about Alexander Hamilton as the core of what we're doing, we're speaking from the standpoint of universal history. We're not really speaking from the standpoint of what we understand 2015 to be. We're not really speaking from the standpoint of what we think the US Congress is composed of. If we do that, if we do the other thing, if we try to do it practically, not only are we going to fail, we will fail in a detestable manner. In an immoral and detestable manner. Although we will appear in our minds to be better than, more informed than, and more committed than people who we believe ourselves to be different from. So, what Schiller discusses is a famous discussion in his essay. This is an essay that he read at the University of Jena when he was 30 years old. He became a professor there, and he distinguished between two kinds of minds. Two kinds of minds among students, two kinds of minds among intellectuals. He said, the course of studies which the scholar who feeds on bread alone sets himself is very different from that of the philosophical mind. The first, who for all his diligence is interested merely in fulfilling the conditions under which he can perform a vocation and enjoy its advantages, who activates the powers of his mind only thereby to improve his material conditions and to satisfy a narrow-minded thirst for fame. Such a person has no concern upon entering his academic career more important than distinguishing most carefully those sciences which he calls studies for bread from all the rest. What we talk about, just get the piece of paper. The famous phrase, just get the piece of paper. It's not even a study for bread, that's a study for paper. Such a scholar believes that all the time he devoted to the sciences of the mind, he would have to divert from his future vocation. In this thievery, he could never forgive himself. He will direct all of his diligence to the demands made upon him by the future master of his fate. And he will believe he has achieved everything once he has made himself capable of not fearing this authority. Now, I'll say something here, just autobiographical with respect to this. Lyndon LaRouche always insisted that the worst thing that you could do, we were back when we were joining in the 1970s, the worst thing you could do is to get a PhD. If you wanted to truly destroy your mind, except if we're like, let's say, engineering perhaps, or something like that, get a PhD. Because, and particularly the German higher degree programs, were brainwashing programs in which what you had to do was you had to support the authority of a group of texts, of an established peer group reviewed set of ideas. And it didn't matter whether the ideas were true. You had to prove your mastery of those ideas. And there was a sort of a process that you take yourself through for what was called a terminal degree. And that's exactly what it was. And that idea of the bread-fed scholar, this idea is the one that we are, I wanted to just address here. He says, once he has run his course and attained the goal of his desires, he dismisses the sciences which guided him. Well, why should he bother with them any longer? His greatest concern now is to display these accumulated treasuries of his memory, and to take care that their value not depreciate. And it just goes on a bit. He says, who rants more against reformers than the gaggle of bread-fed scholars? Who more holds up the progress of useful revolutions in the kingdom of knowledge than these very men? If you want an example of that, you think about anybody who's ever gotten a Nobel Prize for economics. Any Nobel Prize for economics that has ever been given is not only worthless, it is a transgression upon the idea of ideas. Because all of those people have done nothing collectively to change any idea of economic practice for the better in their entire history. And that's a perfect example of wasted, useless, detestable, disgusting upholding of authority and institutional clout against true ideas. Lyndon LaRouche in particular distinguished himself in the days of the 1970s by taking on what he called quackademics. You know, people who were basically these figures with established authority, and he referred to them as quackademics. And what our job was to find these quackademics and find one of them either bold enough or stupid enough to debate him. And what we would do is we would go to the NYUs and the other universities, also Swarthmore colleges and Columbia and so on, and we'd find some individual who believed that he could, in his arrogance, stand up and actually debate Lynn on these matters. And the purpose of this was to demonstrate to the students in the room the bankruptcy of the education they were not getting. And on the basis of that, he created a philosophical faction which was opposed to this kind of deadly established authority. And that's what he did. So I just wanted to start with that before I now do what we're going to do. What we're going to do is, for technical reasons, we can't show the Jason Ross section on Kepler that was done 3 weeks ago. We would do that, but we don't have the capability here in this room. But what I am going to do is I'm going to play the audio from Ben Deniston's speech. Ben Deniston gave a speech at our Schiller conference. And there was something interesting that happened. After that speech, I got 1 or 2 complaints from people who said, seemed like it was what we've heard before, sort of boring, simplistic. And I didn't say anything to them, but I'll tell you what I told Ben when he finished. It's about 15 minutes. I said, that's one of the best speeches I've ever heard. Now, it's interesting to me that various people had that other response. But what we're going to do is we're going to play that now. And we're going to play that as a way of intervening on 2 things. 1, you, 2, me and my presentation. And 3, we're then going to return to what the method is that we're trying to actually use here with respect to you right now, which is the method that we need to use in the street, and which will change, if you do it, not only the number of signatures that we get and our orientation on our deployment, but it will actually change the entire way you think about even approaching thinking about these matters. That's our organization. That's what the Manhattan Project was, and that was what Lyndon LaRouche was always indispensable for as long as I've known him. So this speech began, for those who were not at the speech when he gave it. There were some videos that were shown before it of MacArthur and Kennedy, Lynn himself, and others on the question of thermonuclear war. Also, de Gaulle was shown. So Ben begins in mid-sentence. That's what you're going to hear. And then he has a discussion. He didn't use any visuals, so you're not going to need to see him to understand what he's saying.
I think we just saw some very powerful footage there. I mean, it's from 1945 to today, 2015. This is now 3 generations that mankind has been struggling with this particular challenge, this threat of thermonuclear war. And, I think it's it's interesting to recognize how much the words of General MacArthur 70 years ago, spoken in 1945, are as true and apt today as they were then. Why can we take what MacArthur said 3 generations ago and recognize how much that defines the situation today? And what I'm going to discuss is, I think the issue is that he was addressing certain principles of human history and human development. as was Kennedy in the clips we saw, as was de Gaulle, as was Reagan, as was and is LaRouche, and as we are here right now today. I mean, what are we addressing here? We're dealing with, I think the real issue to take from all this is we're dealing with certain, I would say, scientific principles of the development of mankind. Mankind is a very specific, unique, creative species on this planet and in this solar system. That what we have to recognize in looking at this history is that mankind is a distinct form of life on this planet. We are different from any animal species which we share this planet with. That it's mankind's unique nature to progress, to develop, to advance scientifically and technologically, and to become increasingly a more powerful force on this planet and beyond. That's what makes mankind mankind. And if we deny that, if we deny our true nature, if we deny the powers of thermonuclear technologies, we really deny our own existence as a creative force on this planet. And I think the issue is that we have to realize, despite maybe the beliefs of some, we can't go backwards from this challenge. We can't suppress and hide thermonuclear technologies or the understanding of nuclear reactions. You know, these are part of the natural universe, and it's mankind's nature to understand and utilize and master and develop these principles and new principles beyond them. So we can't change that. What we have to change, as has been discussed here today, is this system of empire and oligarchy, which is the leading cause of conflict. As we're discussing here today, as we're facing right now in the world, and as was cited over a 70-year history, this phenomenon of general warfare, and more importantly, the underlying factors which behind general warfare and drive towards general warfare, at this point have to be eliminated. Because if those factors are not eliminated, then mankind will eliminate himself. By mankind's own failure to rise to address these realities of mankind's own development, of recognizing mankind's own existence as a creative force on this planet and in the solar system. So I think what we're looking at in this history, these 3 generations, this process we're looking at here today, this is a certain historical principle that's been acting from then till now. And all these great individuals that we just witnessed chose to understand and address that principle. And our job here today is not to just look at these individuals and idolize them, but our job is to be like them and to choose to take up the same principle. And today this principle is expressed in space, in mankind's future relationship to the solar system, as China is now leading the way with their effort to rapidly develop their space program. But to get at that, I'd like to trace some of the recent history of this principle. From what we saw with Mr. LaRouche's collaboration with Reagan in creating the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, as an effort for a war avoidance policy based on eliminating the threat of thermonuclear weapons by a joint collaboration between the United States and at that time the Soviet Union in developing new technologies which would eliminate the threat of thermonuclear weapons. From the SDI of that period up through the more recent proposal for an SDE, a proposal for a strategic defense of Earth as a joint U.S.-Russian program to defend the planet from both the threat of thermonuclear weapons, but also the threat of asteroids and comets. And as will be clear in a second, there is a very deep and clear historical connection between this SDI program proposal and this issue of asteroid defense, planetary defense, because it expresses this same principle. Now, just to set up some of the history, it was really only in the early 1990s that individuals in NASA and leading scientists at the U.S. nuclear labs, the national labs, people like Dr. Edward Teller and others, began to put a serious focus on this issue of the threat of asteroids and comets. And it was in 1993 that there was a rather interesting seminar conference held in Erice, Italy, held by an organization known as the World Federation of Scientists, which annually holds conferences on planetary emergencies. And in 1993, they dedicated an entire event to this subject of dealing with the threat of a collision of an asteroid or a comet with the Earth. Now, this Erice seminar, this conference on planetary emergencies, featured leaders from the Russian nuclear labs, the Russian defense establishment, along with their counterparts, their collaborators from the U.S. national labs, including Dr. Edward Teller. These are the same institutions that were involved in the SDI program a decade earlier. And this 1993 seminar on asteroid defense was exactly 10 years after a famous 1983 seminar in Erice, Italy, on planetary emergencies, which focused on the SDI, which brought together at that time leading scientists in the US and the Soviet Union to focus on this issue of beam defense to eliminate the threat of thermonuclear weapons, taking up what we just heard Reagan put on the table before the nation earlier in 1983. So there was a direct continuity from what we witnessed here in dealing with this challenge to overcome this threat of thermonuclear weapons, to taking this issue further to defend the entire planet from the threat of asteroids and comets. Now, following this conference in Italy in '93, in 1994, the process was continued, and a delegation of leading American scientists went to Russia to meet again with the Russian counterparts in basically Russia's equivalent of Lawrence Livermore, their nuclear lab, what used to be a secret science city, ironically in Chelyabinsk, Russia, which was then hit by an asteroid 2 years ago. So that was in '94. In '95, the next year, the process was continued in a similar event held at the U.S. National Lab at Lawrence Livermore, where the same Russian and American scientists continued this dialogue. And the subject of all these seminars and workshops was the defense of Earth from this threat of asteroids and comets, including focusing on the critical role of thermonuclear technologies, thermonuclear explosives, as a critical element to be able to defend the Earth from asteroids, comets, these dangers from the solar system. So you had this process continuing, this realization that to deal with the threats that challenge all of the nations of the planet, Russia and the United States, there has to be a collaboration in these efforts. And all of this is important background to what happened in 2011 when Dmitry Rogozin, who at that time was the Russian envoy to NATO, particularly on the issue of missile defense systems and nuclear missiles, where he posed that instead of the United States continuing this advance of NATO, instead of the United States pursuing this positioning of NATO systems right on Russia's border, as we promised we wouldn't, he said, why don't we instead retake up this idea of collaborating on both eliminating the threat of nuclear missiles, a missile defense program, and collaborating on this threat of planetary defense, addressing this challenge of asteroids and comets. The same principle as the SDI, really the same principle going back to MacArthur. Now, as we've taken some time, and as we know today, so this was in 2011. The United States didn't do this. We followed the policy of Wall Street and London. We continued the advance of NATO under Russia's borders. We've run a regime change operation in Ukraine. We've been following the path of folly that MacArthur warned of 70 years ago. And we're at the point now where this has to stop, or civilization is going to cease to exist. The principle of the issue is today the same as it was in 1945. And what we need is a new idea. As Dr. Teller said, speaking of the SDI, we need a policy of collaboration that's focused on these larger issues, what Dr. Teller called the common aims of mankind, the common challenges that threaten mankind as a whole. So here we are today. It's almost exactly 2 years to the day since this asteroid exploded over Russia, over Chelyabinsk, Russia. It was February 15th, 2013, 2 years tomorrow. And as people remember, this was a complete surprise. No one saw this coming. There was no warning that this asteroid was going to hit the Earth. And in fact, we still don't know even where the vast majority of asteroids are in our immediate neighborhood of the inner solar system. We are effectively flying blind through the solar system through a field of literally millions of asteroids, any one of which could do major damage, could take out a city, a nation, and some of these things even threaten the entire planet. And we're no closer today to being able to deal with that threat. Some advances have been made, but we have not really taken on the challenge that was put on the table back in the early 90s. We don't know where the vast majority of these asteroids are. We have no serious defense system that could stop an asteroid or a comet, even if we knew one was coming. So I think this just takes us back to the beginning, the principle of the issue that we're dealing with. You know, it is only mankind as a unique creative species on this planet that could even conceive of these ideas. You know, mankind is the only being on this planet, the only form of life, the only creative force that could even have potentially the capability of defending the planet. And it's the same thermonuclear technologies which has made warfare no longer possible, which actually gives us the ability to defend all life on Earth from these asteroids and comets. So I think there's an underlying challenge that mankind as a whole is facing with this issue, and it's this principle, the scientific development of mankind as a creative force that we need to rise to understand and fulfill. That we actually have to, at this point, we have to finally overcome this challenge and collaborate with Russia, collaborate with China, join the BRICS and these other nations. That mankind at this stage in development of human history absolutely requires this type of policy of pursuing the common aims of mankind, that we cannot continue to exist on this planet if we don't commit to that principle. If we don't come to realize that mankind has become such a powerful force on this planet that we have to rise to a new level of existence and a new level of international relations that recognizes mankind as this creative force, not only on Earth, but in the solar system. So I think that's the challenge before us today, to keep this short and to leave some time for questions. We have to take, at this point, positive affirmative actions, recognizing and regarding mankind as a unique force with, frankly, an obligation to defend the Earth and move out into the solar system. And if we don't take that as a positive challenge, then we're not going to be able to overcome the challenge before us today.
That's what he said. Now, that is several things that are implied, but they're also actually stated. They're mainly implied only because the peer group pressure of the misuse of language and the abuse of ideas in our society renders the clarity of what he said usually not accessible to people. For example, one of the implications of what he said is that everyone, whether they realized it or not, who has opposed thermonuclear fusion power and thermonuclear power's usage in general has been condemning every species on Earth to extinction. That any such thing as an anti-nuclear policy is not only deadly for the entire human species, but actually will wipe out all life on the planet. Why? Because there are literally, as he said, millions of bodies, asteroids, comets, and so on, floating around whose whereabouts we do not know. And at any point, any of them may be able to eliminate all life on the planet. Therefore, if we do not discover their whereabouts by utilizing the most advanced technologies we know, and those are nuclear technologies, we may have already, as a result of the last 40 years of procrastination in the development of these technologies, condemned the entire group of species and all life on the planet to extinction. That may already have occurred. That's one of the things that's implied by what he actually very clearly stated. Now, there are other things that he stated which have to do with military policy and its implications. He talked about two conferences, one in 1993 and one in 1983. The 83 conference came directly from what Lyndon LaRouche had done with respect to Ronald Reagan, because Lyndon LaRouche gave Ronald Reagan his policy for the Strategic Defense Initiative, something which the Russians were very aware of, which is why the Russians made Lyndon LaRouche an honorary member of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1993. LaRouche then subsequently traveled when he got out of jail in 1994 to Russia and had extensive discussions with the people who were the heads of the program that was discussed at Chelyabinsk and other of those areas. So that's another thing he said there. But what he was saying was that the discussion about nuclear missiles and the discussion about the defense of the Earth are the same discussion. They were 10 years apart, but they were the same discussion. That's another thing that was said. Most importantly was this idea about what distinguishes human life and what human beings do from all other animals, which is the capacity to even have the ideas about asteroids, about human extinction, about species extinction. No other form of life we know of has these ideas. And without those ideas, you can't stop it. That may imply that mankind is the universe's local answer to the solution of the otherwise inevitable extinction of life. Let me repeat that. Maybe the universe created mankind's ability to reason in order that that would solve the problem of universal species extinction of life in this locality. How do you know that that's not true? And if it is true, what does that mean about our desire to walk away from that responsibility? Those are some of the things that were implied in what he said. Now, the reason I say that is because those are in the speech. You just heard that. And if you were struck that you didn't hear it, here is where LaRouche's intervention today is of utmost importance because I want to now take up something different. I don't know how familiar people are with the reading of or with Greek tragedy. You know, there's Sophocles, there's Euripides, there are various writers. And in Greek tragedies, what happens is that a kind of hereditary mistake is passed along from one generation to another, continually, more or less. And there's different ways in which this is manifest in the different tragedies, and I don't want to here to take any of them up in particular, but I want to point something out to you. Plato was severely critical of Greek tragedy. And the reason he was critical is because he said it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to pass along an hereditary mistake. Now, why do they get passed along? Well, often they're invisible to the people who are perpetrating the mistake. That's the Oedipus tragedy. That's the point of the Oedipus tragedy. Oedipus, who is in some sense brilliant, because he's the person that discovers the mystery of the Sphinx and frees the city from the dominance of the Sphinx earlier in his career, is unable to see that he has condemned the city to a famine that's gone on for 7 years because of his blindness to the fact that he has killed his father and slept with his mother, etc., and had kids by his mother and so forth. And what's done in the drama is that it's laid out in such a fashion that Oedipus condemns himself, but as is said, there are no mysteries, there is only blindness. It's a sort of a famous phrase in Greek tragedy. There are no mysteries, there is only blindness. Let's take today and what happened with respect to our deployment. Now, what we did with the rally was fine. It was good. But there was something that should have been embedded in the rally, as it has to be embedded in every meeting we do and everything we do, which is, what is the next step? How does it go higher? How do you, at that location, in that moment, what are you doing, which is now going to cause the process to go to the next level? Because if that's not built into what we do, then in the same way in which, right, economies fail, societies fail, because there is no principle of progress embedded in them, so in our actions the same thing will be true. Now, where did the hereditary mistake come today? It came actually from me. It didn't come from you. The mistake came from a way in which an orientation was about to be given in a class that would have discussed Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, would have discussed Zbigniew Brzezinski and his relation to 9/11, would have discussed Prince Bandar and how Saudi Arabia and HSBC are interrelated, would have discussed a lot of things which are very important in one sense for you to know. That would have done nothing to actually advance your own understanding of why you should not only be doing what you're doing, but why you, like we, can get 1,000 people in this area to do this. Not because we want a number, but because the impulse tendency would be this. See, if we really understood what moment we're actually living in right now, we would all be doing things much, much differently than we are. And what happens is that the understanding of this shifts. And it shifts because looked at globally, in other words, looked at not from the standpoint of reading a newspaper or trying to figure out your individual relationship, what can you do individually, because that's limited. You've got limited time, you have limited focus, and there are limited things you know, right? So if your actions are not part of an organized force, and if the organized force is for any reason misdirected, then the impact of your actions is lessened over what it would otherwise be. Now, how do hereditary mistakes work? Once, a long time ago, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a series of articles called Beyond Psychoanalysis. And we don't really, people who read them at the time had one relationship to them it seemed, and they were discussions of Freud and psychoanalysis as such, but there was a point to the title. The title meant, and the particular reason for the writing of the articles is exemplified in the following way. If you go to a meeting and you have, let's say, 100 people in a room, and let's say it's a meeting at Columbia University, and let's say it's some character who you know to be close to a person like Victoria Nuland, and you know that people at Columbia are basically involved in perpetrating this atrocity in Ukraine. If you go to that room and that meeting and you stand up, you're very clear what you want to say, and as you begin to talk, you hear different words coming out of your mouth than what you intended to say when you got up. Why does that happen? That was the very specific sort of example that LaRouche used for why he was writing his series. Why do people who know perfectly well what they have to do, confronted by or standing up in a group of people, why is it that they will begin to bend and twist and shape what they are saying into a form that's unrecognizable to them? And then what happens is, when they leave the room, they will remember, they will suddenly know all the things that they wanted to say. You know, sometimes somebody to guard themselves will wait for like an hour, and then an hour later they're all pop back in their head. Why does that happen? And his point was not, oh, that's just because you're a coward. No, he said the mind at that point is actually grabbed by a different sense of identity. And the issue is to remove that flaw, that dynamic flaw, from the human mind of the individual. It's not a matter that this is something that is the fault of the individual. He said, no, in fact, this is a social practice. It's a socially acceptable practice. That's why most of the time, most conversations, as the Seinfeld TV series proved, are about nothing. In effect, that was what the point of the series was not it. The point is that's how most conversations that most people have most of the time are. They have no content. Because as soon as you introduce content, then you introduce the implications of what that content means. And the implications are usually that you should do something, because most of the things you would talk about, if you really were talking about what was on your mind, would require you and those people to do something completely different than what you're all doing. We all know this. So his idea was, how do you go beyond psychoanalysis? How do you go beyond having to, in other words, go every week to somebody, sit down on a couch and like tell them these things, which, by the way, you probably should do if you had those problems. But why can't you just do that yourself, like before that happens, right? Like in midstream. Okay, so what Lynn has done, what LaRouche has done is, he has this thing called the Manhattan Project. And what the Manhattan Project is, it's supposed to be the intellectual equivalent of a nuclear explosion. The intellectual equivalent of a nuclear explosion. Now, why? Well, because in Manhattan you can do that anyway, because in other words, you've got, first of all, not only so many different people from different places, but you have a lot of people in Manhattan that really do know what, and we will change the word here, shall we say, bovine scatology is. Yes, yes. Okay, they know they can detect it, right? They have a very good nose for it, and so the taxi cab drivers believe that they could be the governor of New York, right? And sometimes they're right, at least comparably. And so we pick Manhattan because you can, in fact, with the population of Manhattan, and not just Manhattan, but the New York City area, people know when you're making sense and when you aren't. They also know when you're saying something to be overheard saying. This doesn't mean that they are going to, fight willingly with you to change the world. No, but if you are actually committed and if you're actually working in a certain direction, this population, because it happens to be a kind of a metaphor, sort of a microcosm of the entire world. That's who's here. The whole world's here. And therefore, hereditary mistakes of judgment are not something that you have to be condemned to in a Manhattan setting. But now that's not enough. You also have to have an organization and a form of organization whereby if a mistake is being made, that mistake can be corrected, because you've got, in one sense, kind of a chain of command, but it's not a chain of command by any sort of authority. It's an intellectual question. So what happened was real simple. I haven't talked to, I'm just giving you, I haven't talked to Lyndon LaRouche. I have no idea what he actually said about why it was wrong, but as soon as he said it was wrong, I knew what he meant. When he said Kepler, I knew what he meant. I said, oh, I get it. You mean what the problem really is when you look at where we are as a human race, if we're not constantly talking to people about the fact that we've got to look at this from not merely a planetary, not merely a solar system, but a galactic view in the sense that Kepler looked at it. What does this mean? I mean, this is during the 30 Years' War. This is one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history when Kepler was writing. Kepler himself had many problems, which I won't get into. I mean, he had multiple vision, for example. That's sort of a problem for an astronomer. You know, he had problems being able even to see. So he didn't do anything which was based on his own sensory sort of aggrandizement. He wasn't doing anything for the purpose of winning friends and influencing people. The idea was to try to figure out, from the standpoint of his best approximation of the mind of God, how creation worked, and to have some notion of why there was a necessity to it. Not just like, can we come up with a construct, or is there a story we want to tell about it, which many people had done, and many people had done it eloquently. He wasn't doing that. The notion was, what are the physical principles that make it necessary that there is a mankind? What physical principles can we determine that make it necessary that there is life and there is a universe? Why is it necessarily true? Because once you've established that, then you have a basis for what you're going to say about the mind of God, about not only that, but about morality, about human action, that is unassailable from the standpoint of the individual sense of identity. Then you can do whatever you need to do. So the conception is this. We all know, you went out today, you talked about it, how close the world is to nuclear war. You also know there's an alternative, there's a solution concept. The BRICS nations, what we've talked about. Now you also know that getting from here to there seems to, even to you, to be, well, not really clear that how that's going to happen. Well, but on the other hand, you know that if you have the idea of the solution, that the solution is practical. Why? Because there is no such thing as an abstract idea. All ideas are concrete. They're ideas about something. If it's concrete, and if it's also being done in part, then you know it is doable. So how does this happen? Well, it's a question of will. Now, not simply the will to power of Nietzsche, we just will that it's going to happen and it's going to happen. No. The problem involved is to activate, by means of chain reaction, an intellectual chain reaction, a sense of creativity on the part of the people around you, their own sense of creativity. That is, their own sense that they understand not what you said, but they understand that they know what they need to do about what you said. You repeat that. Not just that they understand what you said, but they understand that they understand what to do about what you said. Now they're not going to know, otherwise they can lie to you that they don't understand you. Right? Those people do this all the time. They understand what you're saying. But they understand what you're saying has an implication for what they're going to do. And the way they've got it set up, or it's been set up for them, as far as they're concerned, they're a prisoner. They are hostages to circumstance. That's their problem. If you cannot convince them of anything. All you can do is activate by means of a chain reaction a sense in them of the same necessity you feel, if you feel it. And that actually often is not conveyed in words. You use the words, but actually what you're conveying is not coming into words. That the human identity pre-exists your words. Your human identity and theirs. If you speak to their identity, you don't really speak in words. This is not mystical. This is something that everybody actually has done that at some level, at some time. You've all done it. So it's in this realm of the human identity, the human communication, which is not the communication of the particulars, all of which you need, then that's fine. But that was the mistake introduced into the vicinity of the deployment, and your signatures express that. You would not have that result. And certainly you would not have had ignorance of the results. See, right? Nobody here knew what that was. You had no idea it was that low. So there was a blindness that was introduced into the environment, but it did not come from the deployment. Now, why is this important? Because it was correct. And that is why we can win. That is why we can defeat an Obama. That's why we can defeat anybody else. In fact, we're not even fighting Obama. Huh? We're not fighting flesh and blood. We're fighting principalities and powers, right? Forces of darkness and wickedness in high places. Okay, well, now we can come back to Obama. That's it. But it's not about him. That's what we're fighting. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to say. I think I'll limit it to that. And I think that what's important is we intend to correct these mistakes on the run. You know why? That's how militaries win battles. Commanders make mistakes all the time in battles. People die as a result. So what you have to do is you have to change those midstream, and victory often happens as a result. So that is what we're doing, and I hope that that's something that people will be able to use in the upcoming days as we move to our March 21st event, where we need to break out and have 300, 400, 500 people in the room and have a situation where we're on our way by the spring to 1,000 people in this area doing what you were doing today. That can be done, but only by this form of internal self-correction, by having a philosophical outlook rather than a practical one. Okay. What we talk about, just get the piece of paper. The famous phrase, just get the piece of paper. It's not even a study for bread, that's a study for paper. Such a scholar believes that all the time he devoted to the sciences of the mind, he would have to divert from his future vocation. In this thievery, he could never forgive himself. He will direct all of his diligence to the demands made upon him by the future master of his fate. And he will believe he has achieved everything once he has made himself capable of not fearing this authority. Now, I'll say something here, just autobiographical with respect to this. Lyndon LaRouche always insisted that the worst thing that you could do, we were back when we were joining in the 1970s, the worst thing you could do is to get a PhD. If you wanted to truly destroy your mind, except if we're like, let's say, engineering perhaps, or something like that, get a PhD. Because, and particularly the German higher degree programs, were brainwashing programs in which what you had to do was you had to support the authority of a group of texts, of an established peer group reviewed set of ideas. And it didn't matter whether the ideas were true. You had to prove your mastery of those ideas. And there was a sort of a process that you take yourself through for what was called a terminal degree. And that's exactly what it was. And that idea of the bread-fed scholar, this idea is the one that I wanted to just address here. He says, once he has run his course and is capable of actually acting on behalf of humanity as opposed to bestiality. If that does not happen, no matter what good intentions anybody expresses, no matter what it is people think they are doing, despite that, we will be destroyed. Why? Because the civilization will have proven that it is morally unfit to survive. How will it do that? It will do that because under the guise of actually addressing the problem, people will actually go along with the problem. But they will just have good words, pretty words, or ugly words, which basically accompany their way to the grave. Even as they convince themselves, they delude themselves, they're doing the right thing. Now, this is a very important point because Lynn has consistently insisted on this idea of this scientist, Johannes Kepler, and his work as being essential for everyone to understand and everyone to start from the standpoint of his work. This is crucial because one of the elements of the Manhattan Project, just let's say directly, is Lynn is not a Confederate. He does not believe in confederacies. He doesn't believe in confederacies of dunces. He doesn't believe really of confederacies of ostensibly smart people who think they are doing something they're not doing. You know, people are very willing to criticize the United States Congress for what it doesn't do. But if you were talking to the people in the Congress, and you talk to them often, of course, one by one, often they can give you very intelligent reasons why they're really doing something important. And actually, the things they say are sometimes important. But the truth is, civilization will be doomed by their interpretation of what they think is important. Whatever they think they are doing. How does one remove oneself from that situation? That's the first thing. Well, so what we're going to do is I'm going to refer to something here because Lynn is very critical about what he calls people being practical. People try to find the thing that will practically work. They're willing to talk about something else that they understand to be true, but they are not willing to do what's needed to be done to get that new objective, in this case, the Eurasian Land Bridge, and the New Silk Road, and the World Land Bridge, the evolved concept that Lynn put forward. How would that actually be accomplished? So what I'm going to do is to refer here to, since the conference we've been doing, they've all been Schiller Institute conferences, it's a good idea to refer to Friedrich Schiller here, and his essay on universal history. Why universal history? Well, because when we intervene in New York on behalf of Greece, we're intervening on behalf of universal history. When we intervene with respect to the idea of creating a new economic and credit system, we're intervening from the standpoint of universal history. When we speak about Alexander Hamilton as the core of what we're doing, we're speaking from the standpoint of universal history. We're not really speaking from the standpoint of what we understand 2015 to be. We're not really speaking from the standpoint of what we think the U.S. Congress is composed of. If we do that, if we do the other thing, if we try to do it practically, not only are we going to fail, we will fail in a detestable manner. In an immoral and detestable manner. Although we will appear in our minds to be better than, more informed than, and more committed than people who we believe ourselves to be different from. So, what Schiller discusses is a famous discussion in his essay. This is an essay that he read at the University of Jena. When he was 30 years old, he became a professor there, and he distinguished between two kinds of minds. two kinds of minds among students, two kinds of minds among intellectuals. He said, the course of studies which the scholar who feeds on bread alone sets himself is very different from that of the philosophical mind. The first, who for all his diligence is interested merely in fulfilling the conditions under which he can perform a vocation and enjoy its advantages, who activates the powers of his mind only thereby to improve his material conditions and to satisfy a narrow-minded thirst for fame. Such a person has no concern upon entering his academic career more important than distinguishing most carefully those sciences which he calls studies for bread from all the rest. But there's a very useful thing that was just been shown. Okay? It's not a matter of, oh, nobody got any signatures. The difference between what we deployed ostensibly to do and what happened. Why was it? Why was that difference? Well, we're going to start with something here, and this will be up on our website. Over the last 2 hours, or sometime in the last 2 hours, I received a call which came from Jerry Rose, who'd spoken to Lyndon LaRouche and who had described to Lyndon LaRouche what the presentation was going to be that I was going to give for this meeting. He said, that's wrong. He said, you must start with Kepler. If you don't start with Kepler, if you don't start with physical science, you are wasting everyone's time. Why did he say this? Why did he say this? Now, this is very important because one has to understand what the Manhattan Project actually is. This has been used as a term and it's been described in various ways by various people. Since I happen to be in the center of this, and I'm the person that designed the presentation, and that's the presentation that Lyndon LaRouche said would be wrong, then I feel highly qualified to speak to exactly this issue of what the Manhattan Project is. The situation now, worldwide, is that right now, mankind will be plunged into a thermonuclear war unless a group of people decide that they are capable